It was the end of summer in 2009. My mom and I were taking a last-minute weekend trip to go see my grandparents long before school had started. My grandparents lived out in the middle of nowhere, or so I called it. I was a teenager at the time, and being out in the woods wasn't really my thing. There was nothing to do but sit around the kitchen, talking with my mother and grandmother, or hanging out with my grandfather in his woodworking shop. He loved to tinker around, making all sorts of wooden things, anything from bowls to tables and chairs, and he sometimes sold at local swap meets. When we arrived at their house, my mom headed inside, and I went straight to the woodshop to look for my pop. Sure enough, I found him in there, working on something I'd never seen him make before. He was leaning forward, carving a bust out of a piece of wood, but it did not look like a human head. He was carving some kind of animal, something with long fur all over its head. I watched him for a while, finally asked what he was making. He looked me straight in the eyes, asked if I had ever heard of a Dogman. I slowly shook my head, no, and wondered for a minute, what is he talking about? It sounded like some sort of mythical creature. Like, was it a dog, or was it a man? He sat the piece of wood down, asked me to come sit next to him. He said he had something to tell me, now that I was old enough to handle it. The story he was about to tell me had happened 25 years before, in 1984, long before I was born, but he still thinks about it every day. The day he saw a creature that he's convinced lives somewhere in the woods near their house, but he can't prove it. It was October of 1984, and he was working on building the woodshop back then. He was doing it all on his own, by cutting his own timber, planing it himself. Back then, he was still working his job and had to do a lot of building at night. During the summer, this was fine since the sun set late, but in the fall, the days were getting shorter and shorter. One evening, he had worked a little longer than usual, forgetting how soon the sun was now setting. It was already dark by the time he began clearing up his tools and bringing them inside for the night. As he was putting them all away, he realized that he couldn't find his axe anywhere. He looked all around the work area outside, the garage door, before realizing he must have forgotten it out in the woods where he had just cut down a tree. Now, you've got to understand my pop. He's super meticulous and would never be able to sleep if it wasn't in its proper spot in his garage. Little did he know that something else was about to happen that would make sleeping difficult for years to come. He grabbed a flashlight, wandered off into the woods to find the axe. He knew those woods like the back of his hand, wasn't nervous at all, but said something about that night just didn't feel right. He had this weird feeling, like he wasn't alone. Retracing his steps back in the direction of the cut tree, but kept hearing a low rumbling noise that made him stop and listen. Each time he stopped, the noise would stop, and when he started again, the noise started again too. He described the noise as a low growl, kind of like a deep breathing noise, a noise that he'd never heard before in his life. Finally, he reached the tree, and sure enough, the axe was still stuck in the stump, waiting for him to grab it, right where he left it. Happy to have found it, he grabs it, quickly turned around to get back home before Grandma would start worrying about him. He swung the flashlight around, took one step towards home, when he came face to face with a creature whose own features stunned him and froze him mid-step. This creature towered above him, blocking his path back to the house. It was completely covered in dark fur, very thin and muscular, resembling a human, kind of like a man with the face of a dog, and standing on its two back legs. The two of them stood there, staring at each other. My grandpa frozen in place, and this dog-like creature gazing down with its amber eyes, glowing back at him in the light of the flashlight. Grandpa said that all he could think about was the drool dripping from the creature's mouth, and he thought for sure he was a goner. Just as quickly as the encounter happened, the human-dog creature leapt off into the woods, letting out a howl that sounded like a human screaming. Grandpa listened to the horrifying howls until they were faint enough he felt safe to continue on the path back home. When he finally got there, Grandma was a mess, wondering what had happened to him. He told her he had gone off for the axe and had gotten off the path, mixed up in the dark woods. She could see from the look on his face, it was something else, that he indeed had not gotten lost. Besides, she knew that he knew those woods like the back of his hand. That day in the woodshop, he told me that he never did tell Grandma what he saw, and that I was the first person in 25 years to hear the story. But even still, he thought of that creature every day and never went back into the woods at night, never forgot his tools again. With that, he handed me the carved bust that I could now see was this dog-man creature. He told me to never forget what lives out in the woods, and we should always be alert to our surroundings. I know you might all say I'm crazy, and that maybe I didn't see what I saw, or that I was seeing things because it was so late at night. But my mother did not raise a fool, and I know what I saw. I saw it clear as day. Nobody can change my mind. I'd been working the night shift at the drive-thru for about a year. I had not seen anything stranger than a few strange people walk through the drive-thru, trying to order like they didn't realize they were in the car. Those kinds of problems I can handle. But this was something else. I was standing there at the counter, looking out the window. From that window, you can see the interstate on one side, and woods on the other. That day, I was just standing there, looking and daydreaming, when I heard this strange noise coming just from the edge of the woods. You have to understand that there isn't a soul around, let alone a customer. During these super late-night shifts, the manager only keeps the place open because of something to do with franchise obligation and quotas of opening hours. I'm not sure. But the truth is, nobody is coming for a Beaver's Big D Daddy burger at 4 a.m, period. The manager knows this, but convinces us to work this shift. It's double time pay, and we usually don't have to do much work while we're there. Seriously, the guys I work with, they cook up about a dozen burgers at the start of the shift, throw them in the steamer, then they sit around on cardboard boxes, playing poker all night. If someone does come through to buy a burger, they get one that's about as fresh as they are in those wee hours of the morning. Just like every night, the guys were in the back with their cards, and I was working the drive-thru counter. In the daytime, there are 2 windows working. The first one, where people place their orders, and then the servant hatch, where somebody gives them their food. On these night shifts, both jobs are me. I take the order, and then wander over to the serving hatch to hand over the food. Most nights, though, I don't need to move from order counter, because no one orders. So, I got all set up with my own chair and phone charger so I can watch TV. That night, I'd forgotten my charger, so I was reading some trashy novel I found in the storeroom, just staring out there, thinking of not much. That's when I heard the noise. It was like a cracking, like something moving around in the woods, right up close to the edge of the road, opposite the drive-thru window. My first thought, I wondered if it was raccoons, because once in a while, they come around, looking for leftovers in the trash bin. And if they spill them over, guess whose job it is to go and clear that mess up? I leaned out of the booth, over the ledge through the space under the glass, to see if I could get a better view of where this strange sound was coming from, and I had to check the trash cans, hoping they were still upright. I didn't see anything at first, so I was about to say shoo to those little raccoons when I saw a shadow on the parking lot. I know that when light's behind you, it can really stretch your shadow out and make you look really tall or whatever. But that's not what happened here. As soon as I laid eyes on that shadow, I just knew something was wrong. Sometimes, when I tell people what I saw, they like to say it was probably just some drunk guy in a wolf suit, or a punk kid, playing a prank, something like that. That's fine, but if that's true, then he must have been some kind of basketball player, or else he was on stilts. I mean, the shadow that belonged to was at least 7 foot tall. And then I saw this thing. I watched it slowly work its way out of the woods. At first, it was crouched down, kind of like a dog or maybe a bear. But then, it just stood up. And not like a bear does. This was not some animal attempting to balance on its hind legs. It stood up, like it was used to walking on 2 legs. Walking just like a person does. But you could tell it wasn't a man. I've had some people tell me it could have been a Sasquatch, or maybe a UFO or aliens, but it looked more like a werewolf. I know that sounds crazy, but that's just what it looked like. The way its face jutted out, its snout, or muzzle, whatever it's called, there were like these teeth. It appeared to be like 2 rows of pointy teeth, and lots of straggly hair all over. It was long, looked very unkempt. I wanted to scream, to holler to the guys in the back, but I was scared that if I made a noise, it would turn and see me looking at it. And there was nothing but a small piece of plexiglass between me and the outside of that drive-through window. The glass doesn't even go all the way down. I mean, I just leaned out a few seconds ago. Some people think it's like reinforced, or maybe bulletproof. Maybe at McDonald's or Wendy's, but this is just regular old glass. I had these visions of that thing breaking through and lunging for me. Its hands were hands, not paws. I'm talking hands, like a human being's, but with longer fingers and large black claws on the end. I just thought about them breaking through the glass and grabbing at me. All of a sudden, it froze, went completely still, and raised its head, like it could smell something, tasting it, searching for a scent. I just knew in that moment I had to get out of there, to move before it noticed me. So slowly, I backed away from the window, taking these tiny little footsteps, never pulling my eyes off of it. As soon as my hand reached the door, I pulled the fire alarm, and the whole place went up with sirens and this high-pitched wailing. I just turned around and screamed. By the time the guys from the back ran outside to look, it was gone. Nothing but an empty parking lot, some dark trees, and the interstate. I knew the guys would not believe me, and I don't care. You might not believe me now, but it's the truth. I'll tell you something else that's true. That right there was the last time I ever worked a night shift, and the last time I will anywhere else. I don't know what that thing was, and I have no desire to really find out. I hope you enjoyed my story. I'd always hated Fuller's Wood. And to be honest, if it hadn't been for me having the dogs with me, there's no way I would be anywhere near them at that time of night. I used to have to walk through the woods on my way back from college, but they creeped me out so much that eventually I began getting off the bus one stop later, walking back the long way around. I mean, at least there were streetlights. On those paths in the woods, you could hardly see where you were going half the time, or who's there with you. I mean, anything could happen. The only reason I began going back into the woods was a job. I'd been at college for about 2 semesters. I was really beginning to run low on cash. I'd had a job the previous summer, but it ended at the start of school, so I hadn't worked since then. I asked around my friends to see if there was anything going on. One of them suggested dog walking. I know it sounds crazy, but honestly, I loved it most of the time. I've always enjoyed animals, and except for one or two that get a bit boisterous now and again, the dogs in our neighborhood are pretty good. At least the ones I had to work with were. Basically, the job is what it sounds like. At a certain time every day, you show up at the house of somebody who isn't home and can't take their dogs out as often as they might like. You collect dogs, their leashes from a few homes, and then you just take a whole bunch of them out for a walk. Make sure they get some good exercise. Anyway, you cannot let the dogs off the leash in a busy area. One might run out in the road, or whatever. They could even get hit by a car. The real trick, though, is to find a piece of open ground or woodland where you could let them off in the leash to have a proper runaround. That's why I started going back into the woods again. This gave the dogs some space to run around, and I figured nothing much was going to happen to me if I had 6 dogs with me at the time, Until that night. I actually did not feel scared at all going in there, as long as these dogs were with me. But now, well, I'll never go in there again. So that night, I go into the woods, and I let the dogs off their leashes. Most times, they stay fairly close and just kind of play and jump all over each other, sniff each other out, like dogs do. But something changed. It's weird, because you'd think that only loud sounds and noises would make you pay attention. Like if a balloon bursts, or a car backfires or whatever. But the same thing happens when sounds stop. When things get quiet, you notice. Like when the sound should be there, and then it stops or goes away. You suddenly get really hyper-aware. That's what happened to me. The dogs had run off ahead, but after a minute or two, I couldn't hear them anymore, and that's weird. Anyone who's had dogs will tell you, they're not quiet animals, especially when there's a few of them together. They're always barking or yipping at each other, or whatever. But suddenly, it was like they just fell off the face of the planet. Suddenly, they all went silent. By this point, I was starting to get a bit scared. So, I walked a bit more cautiously. Then, as I turned the corner, I saw them. All of them together. They were lying on the ground, in the middle of the path, all on their backs, silent, with their bellies exposed. When they do that, it isn't just because they want a belly rub. It's a submission thing. Like the weaker dogs will do it in front of the leaders of the pack, or the alpha male. It's the same thing with wolves. To start with, I wondered what they were doing, and then I saw what it was. It wasn't a dog, and it certainly was not a man. It was some kind of other thing. A thing that shouldn't be. Like it shouldn't exist, or be allowed to exist. Like something made wrong. In a weird way, it looked stretched to me, as if it had been pulled or wrenched too hard when it was formed. For almost a full minute, I stood stock still, frozen to the spot, my legs just refusing to work. I just stood there and watched. It had appeared out of the clearing, from the trees on one side of the path, and it moved in these long strides, like a man would. It stood up on 2 legs, but those legs were not a man's at all. They had a funny backwards arch at the joints, like a dog's leg, or the hind legs of a horse. You could see in the way the muscles moved beneath the fur that it wasn't built like a dog either. It was unbelievably muscled and strong. It had these muscles like knots of cable, like you could tell that with one snap, all the energy could be released, and it could just rip or tear apart whatever it wanted to. I took all of this in, scared to stay, scared to move, and unsure of what to do, until it looked at me. More than anything, I remember its head. It was massive, like a dog's head with ears that just jutted upwards in sharp angles, but huge and muscular. The size and the power of its shape reminded me more of a big predator, like a lion or a leopard, like the whole thing was built to hunt. As it turned toward me, I saw its eyes. They were yellow and just fixed on me, like it was assessing or sizing me up. I saw more intelligence in them than you'd ever see in any dog. There was like a malice, like it knew it was looking at me. It knew that I'd seen it, and knew that I could not outrun it. I saw its head sink down, and all of a sudden, the dogs began to bark. All of them at once, louder and closer. I looked from those eyes to the teeth below, hanging like stalactites, jagged and jutting forwards, and I ran, sprinting towards the open roads with the dog following after me, dragging their leashes. We were all pushing with everything we had to get back to the road, to the light, to safety and people, knowing all the while that if it chased me, if this thing chose to come after me, to see me as prey, I was done for. Luckily for me, it didn't. In fact, I never saw the thing again. Now, when I get down from the bus, I take a different route home entirely. One that takes me far away as possible from Fuller's Woods. That place is creepy, and if you ever come around my neck of the woods, do yourself a favor and stay away. It's just not worth it, in case you end up running into whatever this creature was. About 6 months back, I took up jogging. I have a pretty sedentary job, and after turning 30, I really started putting on some weight. I decided I needed to do something about it. I tried running at the gym, but I hated the treadmill, so I started looking for places outside. There weren't many established trails where I lived in northwestern Ohio, but I had a coworker recommend a rural area just outside of town. It was a small forested area with some old logging roads that were fairly isolated. It was further away than I had planned on going, but I decided to go check it out one day. The roads were rough on my car, but my coworker had been right. It was perfect for what I wanted. Completely isolated. I never saw anybody else. It had trees on both sides of the road, and it was a peaceful run. I established a routine after that. Shorter runs a few days a week around my neighborhood, and 2 longer runs on the weekend. When I ran in my neighborhood, I usually wore headphones, listening to Spotify. But out in the woods, I kept them off. The forest sounds were relaxing, just birds and the wind rustling the leaves. One Saturday, I went out for my normal Saturday run, and almost immediately, something felt off. It took me a while to figure out what was different, but about a mile in, I realized how quiet it was. Eerily quiet. There weren't any birds chirping at all. I could hear the wind, but that was it. I stopped running, looked around, trying to figure out what the cause might be, but there was nothing going on. No cars or equipment making sounds. It was overcast, but there was not a storm coming that I could tell. I couldn't figure out, but I'm also not a zoologist, so I thought there might be some completely normal reason for it. Migration season or something. Feeling vaguely unsettled, I started running again. I'd worked up to 6 miles on my longer runs, and I still had 5 miles to go, or about an hour more. 2 more miles into the woods. Then I would turn around and come back for my car. The next 2 miles were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling. At first, I'd assumed that the creepy feeling was from the lack of animal sounds, but gradually, I felt something else. It felt like somebody was out there with me, watching me. I'm not a paranoid person. I take normal precautions, like reflective gear, and I always have my phone on me, but That's about it. But as I ran, I was kicking myself for not bringing anything with me, even a small pocket knife or pepper spray. Twice as I was running, I stopped and did a very slow 360, looking into the woods, trying to figure out what might be watching me. But I saw nothing. I sped up, trying to get back to my car as soon as possible. I was only 2 miles away now, and could make it under 20 minutes. I was ready to be out of the woods, which made me angry, since this was normally my favorite part of the week. As I closed in on the last mile, I finally saw some movement. Something out in the woods, moving my way. I stopped running again, took a few steps toward the trees. I was on edge, trying to be ready in case it was a bear, or something else potentially deadly. I got glimpses of it, moving between the trees, but I still could not see any real details. When I got a more clear look, I relaxed. It was tall and walking upright, a person. I debated whether I should start running again, or wait and greet the person. It was certainly odd that he was out in the woods, off the road and by himself. He might be hiking, or bird watching, or even working for the logging company, I thought. As he got closer, I noticed a few odd things. He seemed to be wearing a furry hat, or had crazy untamed hair and beard. All I could see was a mass of hair, and he was walking oddly, limping, kind of. Then I broke out in goosebumps. I had thought he was wearing neutral colors. That's why I could not see any bright clothing. But as he came within 100 yards, I realized he wasn't wearing clothes at all. He was naked and hairy. Now, I was fully freaked out. There was a naked, crazy man out in the woods. Maybe a homeless guy or some kind of hermit mountain man type. I didn't know. But I definitely did not want to hang around and talk to him. I took off at a run, trying to get back to my car before he could catch up with me. I glanced back a few times as I ran, but I didn't see him. Then I heard the sound. It was this terrible screech, a cross between a scream and a howl that a wolf would make. In my reflexes, I looked back, towards the sound, and I saw the man or figure again. He was much closer now. He must have been running as fast as I was, through the woods, which seemed impossible. As I watched, he lifted his head, and I saw his face for the first time. It wasn't a beard or long hair. It was clearly fur, and his face wasn't human. It was the face of a dog, kind of like a German Shepherd, actually. And his body, while it was human-shaped, his head was not. He stared at me with the most intense, sharpest eyes, and he opened his mouth again and made that awful sound. It broke the trance I was in, and I all-out sprinted. I can tell you I wasn't far now, and I made it to my car, literally diving in. I pulled out of there, breathing hard, feeling like my lungs were about to collapse. As I was driving away, I tried to process what I'd just seen. Maybe it was some kind of animal or folklore creature. I wasn't sure. It wasn't until later that I would tell some friends about it, and coming from Michigan, they told me it sounds like something called a Dogman. What do you know about this Dogman thing? The following events occurred on September 10th, 2013, in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Standing at the window, I watched my father drive away from the house and down the street. I was finally alone and had the house to myself for the entirety of the weekend. It was a cool autumn Friday. The sky filled with the stars looked so perfect, and it made me feel warm. My boyfriend and I had planned a hiking trip that weekend. We were leaving that day. Looking at the time, I saw it was now getting late, and he would be there any time. So, I rushed to the kitchen, filled my backpack with enough food to last us days, along with a few clothes and a novel to keep me busy. After 45 minutes of waiting for him, he finally came. I locked the house, and we made our way to the forest of pines beyond the streets of my house. The giant pines looked so magnificent, and the wind merciless. But we continued on our trip. It took us 3 hours to hike the path leading to the deepest part of the forest. The view was a sight to behold. We decided to set up our tent at this spot because there was a giant pine tree there, and it looked like a good place to spend the night. We set up the tent, tried completing our chores separately. After unpacking, I brought out some of the food that I had packed for the trip. We ate in very comfortable silence. In fact, I hadn't realized how hungry I was. The food finished almost immediately. After eating, we decided to take a carb nap. But I wasn't feeling like sleeping. So I came out of the tent with my novel in hand, sat under a giant pine tree, and engrossed myself in a great book. For hours I was reading, and then it got a tad chilly. But I could not drop the book. So I moved into the tent and kept on reading. I don't recall when sleeping because, even in my dreams, I still read the novel. Later, I woke to the chilly, freezing temperature in the tent and stood up to put on a cardigan. After doing so, I unzipped the tent and went to go pee. The moon was already shining, so bright and very friendly. It was perfect. Even the stars that shone in the sky seemed to greet me. They twinkled and gave me a feeling of ecstasy, being out in nature. It's completely indescribable. I turned to enter the tent, and I heard footsteps. I froze in place. Was somebody spying on us? Or was it just the wind, I thought. I checked my environment very subtly, but found nothing. The footsteps also ceased. The only sound I could hear was the howling wind and the dancing giant trees being blown. I assumed it was just me being paranoid, so I gathered into the tent, laid down, and tried to sleep. Immediately, I hit the air mattress. I heard it again, this time much more clear. I figured that if I woke up my boyfriend, he might also hear the sound of me. So I called him to wake, but he was so deep in his dream, he did not budge. Then, I thought that there were probably other campers in the forest, like us enjoying the weekend. I ruled it as unimportant, closed my eyes to continue my beauty sleep. It seemed like the stranger never wanted me to continue sleeping, because not up to 5 minutes of my own laying, I heard a loud howl. It sounded kind of like a wolf, but also did not sound like one. I wasn't too sure what kind of animal would make such a noise at all, if it was a howl and not a cry. So I sat up, waited to see if I would hear it again, and it did. Sure enough, the sound came, this time much closer to the tent. Now I became scared and tried waking my boyfriend, but he still would not budge. Until today, I wonder how he could have slept through the noise and not heard a single thing. I picked a bat we brought along for the trip, in case of an emergency. Then, went to the door of the tent. I unzipped it a little to know if I could see the animal. Lo and behold, it stood facing the tent. I was incredibly startled and made a sound. This got its attention, this animal, and it turned its eyes on me. I almost wet my pants. What animal is this? I wondered. It stood about 9 feet tall, taller than the tent, with its hunched back and really long body. What caught my attention was that it wasn't a wolf, but a dog. A strange-looking dog that closely resembled a Doberman Pinscher. Under the moonlight, I could see its bare teeth, and it had a messy black fur all over its body, with what appeared to be a large mane around its neck, just like a lion does. If its fur was kind of clean and shiny, and even glistened silver in the light of the moon, I would have termed it beautiful. but seeing it in this mangy state, I was scared. The beast never moved from its position. It just stood watching me. So I took a few steps back, and its eyes followed my every movement. It had a set of eyes I have never seen in any animal. These yellow amber eyes that glowed up even in the dark, like when headlights hit a deer's eyes, kind of like that, but they were more natural, and they were always emitting a glow. I turned, determined to be on the safe side, hit my boyfriend with the bat to wake him up. He did. He got angry that I hit him, but when he saw that I wasn't responding and looked pale, he quickly concluded something was wrong. So he asked me to tell him why I was in this state. I drew his attention to the unzipped tent door to show him, but this thing was already gone. The only traces of the animal were its footprints on the wet soil. This experience shook me. I could no longer sleep, nor think straight. When morning came, we packed our tent, our belongings, and everything we had, and went back home. I lay on the bed that day, thinking of this animal creature with glowing eyes. It made me realize that some things exist in this world which we do not know. And no, I have no idea to this day what it is that I saw. Once a month or so, I drive over an hour away to a nearby town to visit my grandparents. They live in a retirement home. My family meets there for a special dinner on Sunday afternoons. I was close to them growing up, and I rarely ever missed a dinner. Sometimes I would bring my boyfriend, but mostly I went by myself. Sunday in November, we stayed late, talking. Normally, I would have left by 5 or 6 p.m., trying to get back at a reasonable time so I'd be rested for work the next day. But that night, I didn't leave until around 7:30, which was well after dark for that time of the year, having just been daylight savings time. For whatever reason, I made a stupid decision with the route I chose to take home. There were 2 options for getting back to my house from there: the main highway or a small country road. I often switched back and forth, choosing between the 2, depending on whether I was in a hurry or the weather. The back road was a nice drive. It passed through forests and farms. It was also full of potholes, not to mention dangerous, in weather that wasn't exactly permissible. That night, I had automatically started driving that way, just on autopilot, not thinking. It was late, dark, and prime deer season. I would have to drive slowly and cautiously. I was familiar with the road, at least, so I wasn't too worried. Several times as I was driving, though, I thought I saw deer. Luckily, they were off the road, though, and did not try to jump out in front of me. I got into the most heavily forested section of the drive. It was pitch black in there. No streetlights or house lights anywhere. Just my headlights. I slowed a little more and concentrated on the road. It was much harder to see anything off to the sides, so if a deer were on the edge of the road, I wouldn't see it until the last minute. Then, of course, it happened. Something ran just inside the arc of my headlights. It ran so fast that I could not see it clearly. 1 second it was there, and then it was gone. A minute later, I saw it again. Another quick flash, just off to my left. I kept my eye on it, ready to slam on my brakes if I needed to, assuming it was going to be a large animal. The craziest thing happened then. I saw the flash of brown, but instead of darting back into the woods, it leapt. It jumped across almost the entire road in a single leap. It had launched from the side of the road in the small ditch, and landed nearly in front of my oncoming vehicle on the other side of my car. It did in fact slam on the brakes, swearing up a storm. I know deer can jump far, but not like that. I had not seen it clearly when it jumped, but when it landed in front of me, and I could see that it landed on 2 legs, not 4. It had landed like a person, a human being, and then vanished into the woods. It happened so fast, and it was a dark silhouette. I began to doubt what I saw, but it did not look like any animal that I had ever remember seeing before. I did not start driving again right away. I wanted to make sure that it was really gone first, so I watched my window, looking for more movement. When it happened, I was not prepared because I was looking the wrong way. Either there were two of them, or it had gotten behind me somehow and doubled back. Either way, it came from the same side again, launching 15 feet into the air. This time, it did not land in the road. It landed on the hood of my car. The entire vehicle shook and rocked with the impact. I yelled, grabbing onto the steering wheel tightly. I could see its legs and feet through the windshield as it landed. They were very muscular. They looked mostly like a human in shape, although they were more bent above the knee, and the feet were longer than a human, and had claws. They actually kind of looked like a mix between a canine's feet and a human. Only being on my hood for a quick second, then jumping away. I had no idea what I'd just seen, and I did not care to stick around and find out. I started my car again, after momentarily shutting off from the impact, my knuckles white as I clenched the steering wheel. I was still watching for this animal, but I figured faster was better at that point. I was almost out of the forest when it ran in front of my car again. I swerved into the other lane and hit the brakes. I came to a stop diagonally across the lanes. This animal had stopped on the other side of the road, so this time it was right in front of my range of my headlights. I could see the rest of it now, so clearly. Its chest was massive. It had overly long arms and a huge head. Think like a lion's head, with how big it was. It actually resembled more of a hyena than anything else, with some humanoid features. It was really ugly, and had these large fangs sticking out of the top part of its mouth. And it stared at me. I stared back. Then, just as fast as it showed up, it vanished into the trees. I took off, getting back into my lane and speeding out of the forest. Once I was out of the trees, I didn't see it again. I got home alive, called my girlfriend, and told her what had happened. She thought I was joking and asked how much I had to drink. When she realized that I was serious, she insisted that it had just been a deer, and I was clearly seeing things. Although I told her about the claws and the way the face looked, she said it could have been a stray dog or maybe a large coyote. She didn't really believe me. I guess I can't blame her. The next morning, when I walked out to my car, there were large claw marks dug into the hood of my car. I know what I saw, and my girlfriend still would not believe me. I guess I just don't tell the story to anyone, or maybe a few select people. Hopefully you won't think I'm crazy. I mean, the only thing I can think of is this was indeed a Dogman. I'd heard of them growing up, but I never ever thought I would encounter one myself.